Mark Dolan, and this is GBN America. We'll get that verdict on the all-important vice presidential TV contest in just a moment. But first, a group representing around 15% of the US electorate could be decisive in November. Which group am I talking about? Well, Latinos and America's Hispanic community. Now, Steve Cortez was the lead Hispanic face of the 2016 and 2020 Trump campaigns, as well as working closely with Vance on his successful Senate run in Ohio in 2022. And Steve's new book suggests that Hispanic voters are increasingly rallying behind the Republicans. Let me tell you that Bad Hombre, How Hispanics Will Save America, is out now, and it's got the United States talking. Steve, great to have you on the show. Latinos and Hispanics have traditionally supported the Democrats. Why are some now shifting to the right?
Mark, thanks for having me. And there are really two reasons, both a positive and negative reason. Let me start with the negative. I'll finish with the positive. The negative reason is that the Democrat Party, this is no longer your parents' or grandparents' Democrats. This is not the party of JFK or Scoop Jackson or Tip O'Neill. This is a far more radicalized leftist party. And in that regard, they left a lot of Latinos in the United States behind as effectively political orphans because they no longer find themselves people generally of traditional values, people who, for example, believe that there are a total of two sexes, things as radical as that. They no longer find a home in the Democrat Party. But then there's also a positive side to it, and that is that the America First movement, with its muscular populist nationalism, has proven very, very effective and very persuasive for Hispanics across this country. So it's not just that the Democrats are making mistakes and that they're effectively pushing out a lot of Latinos from their fold. It's also that Latinos are increasingly attracted to this movement. And I would tell you too, Mark, Latinos are really getting politically active for the first time in American history. Of course, we've had millions of Latinos in the United States for all of our history. But in terms of their political activation and becoming really, really important in terms of national elections, that's relatively recent because as an immigrant group, like a lot of immigrant groups at first, focused on making sure that they achieve personal and familial success, not so much worried about public policy. But over time, that changes. And we're seeing that right now. So this group is getting far more political. They are more conservative than the rest of America. And because of where they live in key battleground states like Arizona, Nevada, and even Georgia, which a lot of people don't think of as Hispanic, but it really is, in those states, they could well be decisive. The thesis of my book is that they're going to be decisive, not just in this election, but in many election cycles to come.
So would you say that woke ideas are predominantly a vote loser for the Latino community? And by woke ideas, you just touched on it there, gender ideology, which suggests that there are multiple sexes, multiple genders, depending on how you feel that day. The demonization of the West and the history of the United States as somehow a bad and evil, corrupt country. And of course, the concept of critical race theory. Are these all negative issues for the Latino community?
Absolutely. And Mark, particularly so for Latino men, but for Latinos overall, but especially so, which is one of the reasons I titled the book Bad Hombres. And I make a point, by the way, to profile plenty of women as well. And I say that those proud Latinas are just as important to this movement as the men. But clearly the men have been even more aggressively rejecting the kind of woke ideologies that you're talking about. But of both sexes, when we look at Latinos, one thing that makes them unique and different from other demographic groups in America. And by the way, I'm not going down the rabbit hole of identity politics, right? I mean, these folks are Americans first. They are children of God. They happen to also be Latino, okay? But I would put that down the list of things that actually define them. But one thing that makes Hispanics in America different from other demographic groups is that they have come from countries that are next door to this country or very close, if not immediately next door to the United States, come from Latin America. And while we're very proud of our Latin American heritage, the history, the food, the culture, all of it, we also recognize that we're here for a reason. People like my own father who came here legally to the United States, it's because things were not done correctly in Latin America. It's because of the corruption, the leftism, the statism of Latin America. We came here for something better. And so Hispanics are particularly aware of the failings of the left and sometimes in a much more immediate way because either they themselves or their own parents or their living grandparents experienced it in places like Cuba and Nicaragua and South America where my father's from. So that does make us a different and in some ways unique constituency in the United States.
Understandably so. They've had a taste of socialism and or communism and they don't want to go back to that.
Right.
What about a persona like Donald Trump? I mean, he's a larger than life character. He's a divisive figure for some. Is he well liked within the Hispanic community?
He is, yes, and he has been absolutely critical. Look, the ideas are paramount, and I think the
Mm,
America First movement and its attraction for Hispanics is going to go on long beyond Donald Trump. But in terms of compelling people to get excited about the movement, he really was the indispensable man. And I think that Hispanics, because again, we're not afraid to celebrate masculinity. Hispanics, I believe, really warmed to his
right.
brash, aggressive, sometimes controversial style as a hard charging type A macho US businessman. Now, those very same characteristics get him in trouble with certain groups around the country, but they're very attractive and in some cases even magnetic to a lot of Hispanics. And so that, again, that's why the phrase bad hombres, which of course Donald Trump first used to describe some of the dangerous people coming across our border. And that is absolutely true, by the way. It was true when he said it
Mm.
back in 2015 for the first time. It's unfortunately even more true today. We know, for example, now according to Kamala Harris's own ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that over 13,000 known convicted murderers are roaming the United States, illegal migrants who have been let into this country, and despite their very serious criminal past, they're roaming the country. So that's where the phrase bad hombres first came from. But then it got to be popularized by a lot of folks, frankly, like me, who used it as sort of a tongue-in-cheek appellation that, we're bad hombres because we're going to save this country. So, his masculinity, his style, it particularly resonates with Hispanics and especially so with Hispanic men.
There's a contradiction there in regard to immigration, isn't there? Because American Hispanics are, by definition, somewhere along the line immigrants themselves, but they're
Sure.
concerned about the southern border. So, how does one square that circle?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and listen, I don't think it's a contradiction actually at all. If you really are being honest about the situation, we can both be proud of our immigrant past, whether, again, it's,
Mm.
you yourself immigrated to this country or your parents or your grandparents. And at the same time, though, insist that it is done in an orderly, legal, and controlled manner. And I will tell you this, for example, my own father, who first came here on a student visa to the United States, wanted to stay afterward, had already met my mother, had fallen in love with the country and with mom, wanted to stay here, was denied that visa. And I'm not even sure why. This is many, many decades ago. But he
Mm.
left. Now he got back to the United States the second that he was allowed in. But being a legal immigrant to this country, doing it by the old processes, which really worked so well for this country, it was time consuming, it was expensive, it was not easy. And I will tell you that people like my own dad, when they see then that millions of people can immigrate to the United States on their own terms and simply make up their own rules and disregard the proper laws and filters of the United States, it's incredibly offensive to them, to the people who did it the hard, correct way to come to this country. So we can be proud of legal immigration, and at the same time, absolutely, it's totally intellectually consistent to at the same time say we must insist on strong borders. One other just quick point, because particularly for viewers around the world who may not realize this in the United States, is that Customs and Border Protection, if you think about it a bit, it's actually kind of obvious, but people may not realize this. It's the most Hispanic agency of the entire U.S. federal government, because the people who live near the border are overwhelmingly Hispanic Americans. Of course, it's very helpful for them to speak Spanish. So it's an incredibly Latino agency. So the cops who are effectively guarding the front door to America, who have an almost impossible job right now
Mm.
because of what Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have done to them and done to this country, but those brave people, they're Hispanics, overwhelmingly so, and they see no contradiction in enforcing America's immigration laws as people with names like Martinez and Gomez and Cortez.
Are some Hispanic Americans insulted or angry at the impression, the sense, the perception that the Democratic Party has taken their vote for granted?
Oh, I think very definitely. And listen, I think this is true of working class people overwhelmingly, whatever their
Mm.
ethnicity, whatever their race, because Hispanics, we know by definition, are an overwhelmingly working class demographic. Now, I hope that changes over time. I'd like our community to continue to get wealthier with the most entrepreneurial demographic in America. So I'm very optimistic about the future of hardworking Hispanics. Hispanic men have the highest workforce participation rate in America. But the reality is, when we look at these statistics, Hispanics are of modest means overwhelmingly. And the Democrat Party at one time was the advocate for working men and working women in this country, for working class citizens of the United States. It is the exact opposite now. They really cater to and do the bidding of the ruling class in the United States. And so because of that, Hispanics, like a lot of working class Americans, very much resent that their vote has been taken for granted. And it's why we see such a massive groundswell. And by the way, this isn't just my opinion. I mean, this is what the numbers tell us. For example, if we look at the Pew Validated Voter Survey in 2016, when Trump was largely demonized, I think totally unjustly, but demonized as being anti-Hispanic, he only got 28% of the Hispanic vote, according to Pew, which I think does the best job post-election analysis. He then jumped all the way to 38% in 2020. And in most credible polling right now, he's at least in the mid 40s, and in certain important parts of the country, actually winning the Hispanic vote. For example, in the more rural areas of the Southwest. So we're continuing to see this trend build. If that continues to build, given how big Hispanics are demographically in this country, given that we're a lot younger than the rest of America, the average Latino is a full decade younger than the non-Latino American citizen right now in this country. If we continue to make these kinds of gains among Hispanics with the America First movement, then the movement's future is very bright.
Now, of course, as you know, Latino voters, Steve, are not a single coherent bloc, are we? So what work lies ahead between now and November to win over certain aspects of that community?
Yeah, no, listen, this is a super important point because there are some folks who, although we would group them all in as Hispanic, they don't share much in common other than that heritage. For example, in the southwestern United States, in places like New Mexico, there are families that have been here for 10 generations. There are families who were in what is now the United States before the Pilgrims ever set foot in New England. So they don't necessarily have that much in common with, say, a Dominican migrant who lives in New York City and got here last year, right? Even though we do, lump them all in as Hispanics. But what we do find is, a couple things. One is, again, as I mentioned previously, there is an awareness, which is different from the rest of the U.S. population, about the failings of Latin America and the failings of communism and socialism in Latin America. And there's a recognition that, again, we're here for a reason. It's not because things were great in Latin America. We're proud of Latin America, but we want something very different here in the United States. So I think that's, critically important. And then the other aspect, as I also mentioned, is overwhelmingly a working class population. And what do working class people need in this country? They need opportunity. They need protectionism from predatory trade. That's a phrase that a lot of Republicans, unfortunately, have run away from for a long time. Now, though, there's much more of a debate on those kinds of issues. And of course, both J.D. Vance and Donald Trump recognize that predatory trade from China has been terrible for working class Americans. We need border protection. So not just protection economically speaking, but border protection, because these millions and millions of illegal migrants that have been invited into the United States by Kamala Harris, they are competing in the labor market generally against blue-collar, hardworking American laborers, many of whom happen to be Hispanic and are seeing their wages depressed and seeing unjust, unlawful competition in the wage market. So these are the kinds of messages that I think, if we're effective at delivering these messages over the next few weeks, which is one of the reasons that I strategically released this book just now, and an accompanying documentary by the same name of Bad Hombres, where I highlight 3 Mexican Americans who have achieved incredible success, all up from the bootstrap stories, though. All of them grew up poor Mexicans in South Texas and have now achieved great success and are very conservative. Hispanic Americans are very involved in their community and in politics. I think the more we tell those stories, it is my hope and belief that we're going to get at least into the mid 40s when it comes to the Hispanic vote in the battleground states. And if we do that, we're going to win some of these states because they're going to be really, really close races. And if you get that Hispanic total up by 10, 20, 30,000 votes, that is probably enough to be decisive.
Indeed. Of course, rules are there to be broken, aren't they, Steve, particularly in the world of politics. And Donald Trump's support, for example, is also growing among young black men under the age of 40.
Mm-hmm. And young men in general, by the way. But yes, it's particularly marked among black men. You're exactly correct. Certainly, we're seeing that. I'm doing a lot of polling of the battleground states. And even though I am clearly an activist, and even though I am clearly not objective, I really do the polling very, very objectively. Most of the time, for example, we have, in most of these battleground states, we sample more Democrat voters than we do Republicans. We're trying to be as rigorous and scientific about it as we can be. And what we're seeing, by the way, and part of the proof's in the pudding, Mark, part of it is when I make almost all these polls public and I show most of these races are tied effectively, either exactly tied or very, very close to tied, well within margin of error. But you're exactly right. We're seeing significant moves across young men generally. Now, unfortunately, we're seeing leakage among young women. There's the gender divide for young people in this country right now, people in their 20s, for example, is way more stark than the gender divide is for older folks. For older folks, Republicans have always done, and this predates Donald Trump, Republicans have long done better among men than among women. But the gender divide, say for seniors, 65 plus, it's there, it's real, but it's nothing like this gulf we're seeing with young people right now in this country. Fascinating development, and something definitely for those of us whose business is politics, something for us to pay attention to. Number one, I want to try to persuade some of those women, those young ladies, to come back. But number two, we also want to encourage the gains we're making among young men and see if we can accentuate that.
Indeed, it's a worry for the future, isn't it? We don't want our society divided politically over gender grounds, do we?
Yeah. No, I mean, and to be quite honest, taking this out of just the realm of electoral politics, it concerns me for the future. I mean, are these, ostensibly these folks are going to marry each other and start families. And if they're this divided philosophically, it's not just a cliche, right? A house divided against itself cannot stand. I mean, there's something going on here, and I don't pretend to even know all of it, but there's clearly, this is a trend where young men are moving pretty markedly to the right. It's happening in other countries too, by the way, but I pay most attention, of course, here in America. And young women are moving further to the left. And again, that gender divide at the young ages, it makes the gender divide at the older ages look kind of tame. But yeah, I don't know that that's the right model sustainably for a cohesive society. But that's a much bigger topic than we can address in just these next 5 weeks.
It really is. I mean, young men are pushing back against woke ideology, partly because men are demonized by it. But let's hope that women will follow suit in time, because I believe that it's truly toxic for everybody. Steve Cortez is a former senior Donald Trump and J.D. Vance advisor and is the author of Bad Hombre: How Hispanics Will Save America. That's right. Bad Hombre: How Hispanics Will Save America. It's out now. Steve, the greatest privilege to have you on the show. I hope we catch up soon.
I so appreciate it. Thank you. Please have me back.